Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the MIT Water Summit. My name is Quantum Wei.
I'm Gualtiero Jäger.
We're co-presidents of the MIT Water Club. The MIT Water Club is a student group on campus here. Our mission is to bring together people to connect and learn about water. We do this through a couple of events that we hold. The first is the Water Summit. Another event we hold in the spring is the MIT Water Innovation Prize. That's a business competition open to any student team with a water-related business idea. We connect them with people in the water sector to develop their business plans, and then they get a chance to compete for $30,000 in grant money.
So if you have an idea, please join. In spring, we also have MIT Water Night on World Water Day. That's a night where we showcase research, innovation, art, and education around water. And throughout the year, we have lectures with invited speakers. We have lunch and learns with students on campus. And we have monthly meetings that you're always welcome to join. And please sign up to our newsletter if you'd like to be in touch. All these events, of course, are possible through our sponsors. And we are extremely grateful for both for their support and their mentorship. I would like to mention JWAFs on campus. They are steadfast and really critical. We have PepsiCo, Xylem, and Watts, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, the MIT Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. We have MIT Left Arcade support. From the MIT Management School, we have Sustainability Initiative supporting us, as well as MIT Legatum, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the Harvard MIT COOP. Sincere thank you. And with that, we'd like to turn it over to our summit director, Ivana. She has done a fantastic job, as well as an entire student team in organizing this. It takes long hours, and we're extremely proud of them. So, round of applause, please.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to the summit again. And just a quick thank you to the audience, our speakers and sponsors, and everyone else who made this event possible. As Gualtiero said, it's taken long hours and hard work, so I definitely want to thank Gualtiero and Quantum and the summit team especially for making this event possible. So this year's theme is the Water Food Nexus. So we'll be focusing on the most pressing issues in the water sector in this regard. So we'll reflect on the role of water in food production and the innovation, technologies, policies, et cetera, that enable us to have healthy and sustainable communities. So we're very excited to have a very diverse lineup this year. So we have members from academia, NGOs, conservation organizations, government, and people from industry as well. So the goal of the summit is really to foster a dialogue between these different members with different perspectives on the variety of topics. So the theme of the first day is watering our crops, which is today. So we'll be focusing on water use in agriculture. We'll have two keynote speakers to kick it off. We'll have Professor Chandra Madramootoo and Rajiv Singh. And we'll then have three panels throughout the day. We'll have a panel on groundwater resources, on surface water pollution, and on our uncertain water future in the face of climate change and population growth. And we'll also have a couple networking sessions throughout the day. You can see the agenda here. And at the end of the day, we'll have a poster reception and tech showcase, and that'll just give students and a couple companies the opportunity to showcase their work that's related to the Water Food Nexus. And tomorrow, the topic is growing our protein. So we'll be looking at livestock production and seafood production, and looking at the water footprint of livestock production, the ecological impact of seafood production, and looking at sustainable practices in both of those moving forward. So we'll have one keynote speaker tomorrow morning, Christopher Briggs from the Water Footprint Network, and then we'll also have three panels. So we'll have a panel on livestock production, on seafood production, and then we'll have a closing panel that's just gonna reflect on the previous panels and kind of try to tie everything together and talk about steps that we can take moving forward to meet the increasing food demand. And with that, I will introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Chandra Madramootoo, who's a visiting professor at MIT and a visiting scholar at JWAFs. He'll be introducing the Water Food Nexus to us. So a round of applause.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Ivana, Gualtero, and also Quantum and the organizers of this Water Summit. It's been a pleasure to work with you over the past few weeks to develop this, so thank you. What I'd like to do this morning is set the stage for some of the debates and challenges that we face in food production and water as we think about food security and also some of the challenges going forward in trying to make irrigation, particularly focus on irrigation and smallholder irrigation, which is critical to food security, much more sustainable than it currently is. And obviously, for the sake of time, I wouldn't be able to cover the whole spectrum of water and food security, but just some of the areas that I think that are important and areas that which I work in. Now, if we think that there are about 1,500 million hectares or so of global cropland, roughly 20% of that, or 300 million hectares, are irrigated. And that 20% of global cropland, irrigated cropland, produces 40% of the world's food. So irrigation is particularly important to food security. Irrigation has helped us to deal with water variability and also water scarcity. It's helped us to be able to get 2 to 3 crops a year, moving away from rain-fed production, which is just 1 crop a year, to get 2 or more crops per year, particularly in Southeast Asia. That doesn't say that we neglect the other 1,200 million hectares of rain-fed lands. Of course, that is important, and all of that rain-fed area will never become irrigated, even with spate irrigation and other rudimentary forms of surface irrigation will not be completely irrigated, but there's obviously much more that could be done with respect to improved water management on those rain-fed areas. And one of the points I want to make this morning is that what we normally do sometimes is compartmentalize irrigated agriculture with rain-fed agriculture. But there's actually a gray zone between the two. And there are several rain-fed farmers in many parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and also Asia and Latin America, who do practice some form of water harvesting and water management to be able to get more than 1 crop a year. They might not be able to get 2 full crops, but they can get a partial second crop. So it is very much a gray zone between those 2 categories of water management and agriculture. Now, very quickly, just to point out that most of this irrigated area, as you can see, about over 70%, is in Asia. And you'll see there it's broken up into about 80 million hectares that is irrigated by groundwater, and about over 130 million hectares that comes from surface schemes, tank irrigation schemes, canal networks, and so on. And one point to bear in mind, and I know that there's a panel later on this morning, is that the area that is covered by groundwater irrigation is rapidly rising. And one of the phenomena that we see is that as surface water schemes, canal and tank irrigation schemes become unreliable in terms of scarcity, climate change, maintenance of the irrigation network, farmers are no longer relying exclusively on the established irrigation networks, but are putting in their own tube wells to augment the amount of water that they have for irrigation. And that is putting enormous pressures on the groundwater resource. We only have to look here, for example, in the United States. We look at the High Plains Aquifer in the US. We look at the Indo-Gangetic Plains in north of India. We look at the North China Plains, immense pressures on groundwater and the availability of groundwater to sustain agriculture. But no doubt that irrigation, extraordinary large acreages of irrigation in Asia has what has helped to fuel the green revolution. And as you can see here, cereal yields, primarily the three major cereals of rice, wheat, and maize, have expanded considerably over the period since the start of the Green Revolution in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And unfortunately, one of the factors here is that of the major areas of producing cereals, sub-Saharan Africa remains relatively low. And this is despite some of the recent innovations around drought-tolerant maize and also stress-tolerant rice, that's being produced by Africa, and also Africa rice and Erie. We still see these very low levels of yield improvement and expanded areas under rice, wheat, and maize in sub-Saharan Africa. But apart from the crop technology, water is obviously a very critical factor here as well. Now, you've seen these statistics, I think, globally, that irrigation withdrawals are approximately 70% of the fresh water that's used in most countries. But I think one important point to bear in mind is that this number varies by region. And as you can see here in South Asia and in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, it's much larger than the global average of 70%. Particularly when we look at South Asia and Southeast Asia, over 80%, sometimes over 90% of the water that's withdrawn goes into irrigated agriculture and livestock as well. Unfortunately, in the Middle East and North Africa particularly, and sub-Saharan Africa, although those amounts are quite high, those are very water-stressed areas of the world. So if we look at the ratio of water withdrawn to total water available, there is continuing to be a decline in that ratio as a result of the fact that there's less water available for withdrawal in those areas. Now, where does that water for irrigation go? And as you can see here, particularly on the chart at the right here, you can see most of it is going into rice. Close to 30% of that water withdrawal, particularly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, goes into irrigated paddy production. And you can see wheat and maize follow, wheat being 18% and maize being 13%. Interestingly enough, crops that are much more drought tolerant, such as millet and sorghum, while they do use some amounts of water and they are much better adapted to water stress, their amounts of irrigation are very low. So there is a case to be made for the expansion of some of these minor crops, such as millets, sorghum, barley, and also some of the pulses and lentil crops particularly, which also have biological nitrogen fixation value as well to the soil root environment. And so the question for us today, both from a crop genetics standpoint and an irrigation engineering standpoint, is what could be done to optimize the use of water in maize, rice, and wheat production systems, particularly when we look at the fact that most of those crops are grown by smallholders around the world. Now, the most recent estimate by the FAO says that we would need approximately 60% increase in food production to be able to meet the demands for food by the year 2050. And as you can see, in terms of, again, at the right of this chart, if we look at the cereals, that's where some of the largest increases in food demands will be in the future. You'll also see very steep increases in meat. But the question is, with water scarcity, water stress, dwindling fresh water supplies, and also scarcity of arable land, how much more can we expand the land and water resource base to be able to achieve that need for food? And the reality is there's very little that could be done in terms of fresh water availability and also land resources to be able to achieve some of that need. And more, we're going to have to think about how we improve the irrigation water programs, how we improve our crop management programs as well with better agronomics to be able to achieve those kinds of increases. Now, very quickly, to put this into some perspective with respect to the calories that are consumed, you'll notice here that also those cereal crops, the projections for their consumption increasing by the year 2050 with data from the FAO. And right now, we're somewhere in this area here. And if we look at how we put this in terms of a forecast, in terms of kilocalories, one of the other problems that is very seldom discussed is the whole issue around nutrition. And if you consider that we probably only need about 22 to 2,300 kilocalories per person per day, then the question also with respect to some of the impacts, health impacts that we're seeing around obesity, heart disease and stroke and some of these chronic non-communicable diseases, the question is also how do we intervene with respect to diets to be able to deal with some of these demands for food. So it is quite a multifaceted problem in trying to achieve a solution in which we as consumers or people who are purchasing these food products need to also think a bit more clearly where our role is in that problem. So recent work that's been put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their recent assessment report, of course, shows that the average decline in yields for some of the major crops across Africa and South Asia is probably going to decline by approximately 18%, and it will also have an impact on fisheries. And also the problems that are going to be caused by heat stress as a result of climate change. And the fact that if we continue along our current path of production of or emissions that are produced from our usage of fossil fuels, then this rise in temperature of 4 degrees C is going to have a major impact on the types of crops that we currently grow, which are C3 and C4 crops that aren't able to withstand that kind of increase of temperature that is being projected. So this is also something that we have to take into consideration, and that's why there's also several large breeding programs that are going on in the CGIAR and also in the private sector with respect to development of genetic pathways in crops that can deal with these kinds of heat stresses in the future. Now, very quickly, because this is not really a discussion on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions per se, but I just wanted to point out some of the factors that we have to consider when we think about agronomic management and agronomic practices going forward. And particularly in the developing countries, some of the largest, first of all, that there is quite an increase in the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So although agriculture is not the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, if one considers the transportation sector, the industrial sector and so on. The fact is that greenhouse gas emissions are going up quite sharply in the developing world, and the reverse is happening in an almost stable in the developed world. But there are two major greenhouse gases that are causing these rises in emissions that we see here. First of all, nitrous oxide emissions that are coming from fertilizer and also some from manure, but also methane emissions from manure, the burning of animal dung, and also methane from rice production systems. And the point about reducing water usage in rice is also the fact that you could help to minimize the amount of methane that is being produced in those systems. So that's another factor that we are going to have to take into account as we consider agricultural or agronomic management practices and water management practices going forward, is the balance here with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, work that's been done by the World Resources Institute show where we're going to have some of the impacts. And as you can see here, most parts of the world are colored here in red in terms of a decline in crop yield as we move towards a warmer world. And some of the areas that are extremely water stressed, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, large parts of the Middle East, and also India, China, and South Asia, we're going to see declines in crop yields as we continue to experience rises in temperature. So that's the other call to be able to address some of the emissions of greenhouse gases that would help to protect some of the crop yields that we need to have going forward to meet these food demands. Now, in other work that's been done by the World Resources Institute, and they have a very nice website, the Aqueduct website. If you go on that website, you can find every single crop that's grown and what the impact of water stress will be on those crops going forward. And you'll see country by country on that map, the areas that are colored from green to orange to yellow. And here, overall, you'll notice that in terms of water stress, which is represented here in high-risk areas, 40% or more of the available water supply withdrawn is in excess of the water available, going up to as high as 80%. You'll see here that irrigated cropland, the areas of irrigated cropland that's going to suffer from water stress going forward, it's about 56% of the current irrigated areas that are going to be affected by water stress. And for all cropland, it's going to be about 28% as a result of water scarcity. Cotton being some of the highest areas affected by water stress, 57%. And then you'll see wheat, maize, and also rice in here. As I said, the map shows very nicely where are the areas in the world where this is going to happen. So again, the call for us to be able to better manage water as a result of those water stresses. Now, one of the examples that I like to use in terms of where we can go forward is with respect to the Indus Basin of Pakistan and parts of India. It is the basin that lends itself to the best measurements, has some of the best data with respect to water use and water efficiency. And it has been measured very extensively over the past 30 or 40 years because there are very good controls of water coming in from the 5 large dams that supply water into the Indus Basin. It's the largest contiguous irrigated basin in the world, about 20 million hectares of irrigated land. And also, we know pretty much what's coming out at the various distributaries through measurements that have been done. And there's been a lot of modeling work that has been done as well to be able to extend these measurements. And if you take all of the data that has been collected over several years, roughly about 60%, 66%, 64 to 66% of the water that is withdrawn is actually not going into crop production. Now, to put this into context, of course, there has to be water that goes to maintain environmental flows, in-stream flows, and so on, and to provide water for ecological habitats. So there's no way that one would ever expect this to close the circle in terms of 100%. But certainly on a basin scale, and the largest irrigated basin in the world, contiguous irrigated basin in the world, there is a lot of room for improvement as one looks at this number of overall irrigation efficiency. And the question is, what could be done to bring us up more towards an efficiency of around 60 to 70% in the overall basin, considering the variability in soils, levels of salinization and waterlogging in that basin, and also the fact that in many of these areas, the irrigation water not only provides in-stream flows, ecological flows, but is also being used for human consumption as well. It's not moving that easily. Okay. In terms of engineering, we also have some other challenges in trying to get to this improve irrigation efficiencies. And unfortunately, not all of it is technological. Some of it, a major part of it, is also institutional. Around the engineering part of it, it's how water is delivered to cropland. In many areas, particularly in developing world, water is made available on a rotational basis, what we call the water duty. And so every 5 to 7 days, water is available from the canal delivery structures at the field to be able to supply a farmer with water. Because farmers are uncertain when next they are going to get water and how much is available, there's this tendency to break away from the rotational scheme, and as a result of inadequate surface water deliveries, to themselves block off water in the canals and prevent other farmers downstream from accessing water. So this whole aspect of being able to access water on an equitable basis because of the engineering around the rotational water delivery schedule poses a major challenge for us as we try to rebuild these irrigation schemes. Not to mention very poorly maintained infrastructure, and despite the fact that much work has been done institutionally on the creation of water users associations and also cost recovery by the farmers themselves, this has not really taken off to the point that it has been able to prevent this tail-ender problem and improper distribution of water. So there's also work to be done on the institutional side to be able to address water deliveries in the future. Now here's a map that was produced by the World Bank a year or two ago. It's entitled quite appropriately, High and Dry. And what this map shows is that if we continued with our water management technologies and practices as we know them today, these are the areas that are very much going to be affected today in terms of GDP. So this is a map of GDP, and you see the areas here where current water management programs and policies have a very negative impact on GDP. And if it continues to happen in what we call the business as usual scenario going forward, these areas will continue to get worse. And so here, if we were to start to implement improved practices and policies and technologies, there's probably some hope in that some of these red areas will change to light blue and dark blue, and we could actually see some improvements in GDP going forward, although parts of North Africa and the Middle East, the MENA region, will still be very much susceptible to water stress. So obviously a call here that if we didn't do anything with respect to water management, improved technologies, practices, and institutional systems, we could see very serious declines in GDP in major parts of the world, particularly in India and China. So here's another parameter to put into the equation, and I kind of alluded to it at the start of the talk, and that is how land is distributed and who is actually farming the land. And two key statistics I wanted to point out here is where smallholders fit into the system. And as you can see here, that 92% of all farms are small farms, less than 2 hectares or less. So large numbers of small farms, and you can see here the number of small farmers. The number of people who are farming 2 hectares or less, over 500 million, 500 million small farmers in the world. So we have two situations here that we need to put into the equation, because these are the small irrigators. These are much of the irrigation that we've been talking about is conducted by these people. And in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, about 80% of the food that is supplied in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa comes from smallholders. And so we have to think now, as we look at technologies and management practices and systems, that these large numbers of small farmers are not insignificant to trying to achieve global food security. And I don't see Mark Rosegrant in the room, but the people at IFPRI like to talk about this triangle, this pyramid, and the fact that those 560 million smallholders are in this pyramid, and there's a lot of emphasis on how to segregate that pyramid. And generally, work that's being done by IFPRI, and Mark may talk more about this in his presentation, is that we look at the number of farmers, the largest number of farmers, smallholders, are down at the bottom of the pyramid. And these are people who don't own the land, they're asset poor, they make less than $1 a day. They also don't have access to sufficient water. And the question is then, should we be paying attention to these farmers down here? Perhaps many of them want to actually come out of agriculture. And if governments were to have a policy to buy those farmers out, then the agricultural production system, smallholder agricultural production system, might be much more efficient. And so one of the questions that's being asked as we address improved irrigation technologies, should we not look at these categories of farmers in here, in this top of the pyramid and roughly in the middle of the pyramid here? And certainly the ones at the top of the pyramid, something in the order of 50 to 75 million smallholders, do have the financial resources and are currently able to access particularly agronomic technology. So with a little bit of a push and a stimulus, they might be able to adopt very rapidly, very easily, at their own cost, improved irrigation technologies. And those in the middle here, which are probably the bulk of that 300 million, something in the order of 200 or 250 million, then maybe they need some sort of intervention to be able to help them to achieve better water management. So that's very much a parameter that's looming out there in this whole equation of water and food security that can't be neglected. And so from the institutional standpoint, what is it that we need to do here as well? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to quickly skip through this since I've only got 2 minutes. But, you know, certainly projections by the FAO, increasing crop yields, of course, playing a major role here. But is that really possible going forward? Oops, something going on here. Not sure why this. So a paper by Wada et al. In Nature Geosciences a couple of years ago said that for us to achieve, they gave 6 pathways or 6 wedges towards improved water management in the world, not just for agriculture, but in general. One was to increase irrigation efficiency by the year 2050 by 40%, and to increase agricultural productivity by 20% by 2050. Based on that previous chart I showed you, the question is that possible? But the point I want to make here is that there is no simple pathway. Improvements in technologies, institutions, governance, and policies are required. But one message I want to leave you with, again, coming back to these smallholder farmers in the middle and the top of the pyramid, is I believe water use efficiency and water management relies very much on having better markets. And I think that there's much more that needs to be done on the integration between markets and also improved water management for smallholders. Well, I'm going to skip some of these slides here for the sake of time, since I've only got a few minutes. Not sure. But some of the things that could be done in variable rate irrigation technology, precision irrigation management, to be able to better achieve food security. And being able to map, one of my graduate students trying to map much better with unmanned aerial vehicles, the crop canopy to look at heat stress and water stress using some new camera technology, I think. Innovations in groundwater management, but I know Dennis and his group will talk about that. But coming back to the question of markets, here's what we currently have. Very poorly structured markets from smallholder irrigation schemes. The other problem that we see is large gluts. For some reason, smallholder irrigators, one of the first crops they love to grow is tomatoes. And they look at the price of tomatoes on the market and they start to grow lots of tomatoes. Then they try to sell those tomatoes, and because everybody else is growing tomatoes, they can't get those sold. And so I think these are some of the reasons why we see such poor water management, because they just don't get the economic returns to be able to manage water better. I don't know what's going on. Oops, gone all the way to your talk, Rajiv. But I think for the sake of time, since I have to get off here, yeah, should I just use this? So let me just close on a couple of things, how we add value to irrigated agriculture by bringing in new types of structured markets. And if we can link the input and output to irrigated agriculture through digital technologies and trying to use digital technologies throughout the chain to be able to access credit, mobile banking schemes, and so on, get better access to fertilizer and seeds. You tie that into your product, and sometimes it is an integrated system between the suppliers and the buyers. I think that is going to grossly improve water management. And so certainly something I've just written up about in the Journal of Irrigation and Drainage is this whole new business model around irrigation and what we have to do throughout the chain, including capacity building and training, to be able to improve the value chain. So I'm going to stop there. And on that note, let me also say one of the areas that, particularly if they're anthropologists and sociologists in the room, one factor that requires much, much more attention is the area of feminization of women in agriculture. And feminization in agriculture is certainly something that we have to contend with. That number is growing, the number of women smallholders, and how we improve technology, get them to access credit, finance, markets, and input supplies is something that we have to think much more about going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Madramootoo, for a great presentation. Next up, we have Rajiv Singh, who's the Managing Director of Rabobank North America Wholesale, giving us a presentation as well.
Thank you, Ivana, and it's truly a privilege and an honor to be here today. This is a continuation of a series of engagements I've had with MIT. Particularly thank you to Professor Leinhardt, who we have collaborated with on the food side. So it's great to see that the topic today is the food-water nexus. And the linking pin is the JVOFs and the various other disciplines that are involved in all these different activities here. And it's great to see that you're trying to bring them together. I'd also like to thank Kishore. I don't know if he's here. He was one of the presenters at our food prize. He was the one who got me into this topic and connected me with Ivana, and so glad to be here. So when I sort of initially planned my speech today, I'd done the traditional, so I'm a banker, so I'd looked at the macro, I was thinking of speaking about the macroeconomic trends, the technological trends, and then ultimately the commercial and financing aspects of that to make water technologies, more successful out there in the field. But then I looked at a number of, the lineup that you've had for the panels and all the different speakers that you have, and I said, that's not going to work. That's not going to add any value. So I changed that a bit, and after hearing Professor Madramootoo, I was thinking, this is a great time to be working in the field of water. And let me ask you, in terms of what Chandra talked about, and that we need increased efficiency of water use, of irrigation, and we need increased efficiency of agricultural productivity as well. And where the trends have been almost, if you look at it, they definitely on the second one have been negative generally. On the first one, we haven't made much progress over the last many years. So let me ask you, how many of you are fearful about whether we will have enough water to produce our food in whatever the time frame that you choose, let's say 2050? Just show of hands. Seems like a majority in the room. And so that brings to mind the Chinese proverb that says, to do something, we have to dig the well before you're thirsty. The question is it too late now? And I think it's, I don't know. At least I don't know. I'm sure the people here in the room have a better sense of it. I don't know whether it's too late or not, but it's definitely the best time to be working on the water-food nexus. And that's because there are three forces that are coming together at this point in time, and that kind of a confluence has never happened before. One is, the three basic, of course, to work on things like water, on things like conservation, better food production and nutrition. They all require the human sort of sense of compassion, rational thinking, and so on, so the positive values that we have. But I think there are lots of, for us to really make a change, there's a lot of these negative characteristics that we have that are also important. And those are coming together now. So those are the three that I call fear, sloth, and greed. And that a confluence of fear, sloth, and greed is happening at this point in time that has never happened before, especially in the context of water. Fear we just heard about. I mean, there's clearly the kind of information that is out there about the utter inadequacy of what we can see right now of whether we will have enough water And there are a number of reports that we can go into. There are some of the maps that Professor Madramootoo showed about, where there are going to be severe water stresses going forward. Now that is available to everyone. It's not confined to a small part of the world, and it's not easy for people to migrate off from those parts of the world to go where that's not a problem. The second one is sloth. So everyone, I don't know how many of you describe yourselves as lazy. Probably difficult to admit, but I can admit that that's one of the basic human characteristics is we like to have things made easy for us. And a lot of what has happened in adjacent technologies, in things around the issue of food and water, has made it easier for a lot of what we want to do in water to succeed. And that's around data science, that's around a lot of technologies on genetics, that's in the number of engineering fields that then have the impact on what we can do on the fronts related to water and food production. But it is also in the area of financing and markets, which Chandra touched upon at the end there. A lot is happening in terms of how capital can be allocated, and the information that these sources of capital have to allocate that capital well to a lot of these initiatives that wasn't there before. So I think that the confluence of technology, data, and capital being available to some of these applications hasn't happened before. It's making it easier. It's addressing that second sort of characteristics that I called that's around sloth. And the third one is greed. Again, it's a basic human tendency. And I think what I'll talk about mostly today is that there's a lot of money to be made now in those areas that have an impact on better water production, use, and ultimately, therefore, better food production, use, and nutrition. And that, again, hasn't happened before. So while it's definitely true that we have to dig the well before we are thirsty, it's darn difficult to do that unless there's a confluence of all these different factors that are coming together. And I think they are coming together now. So I was telling before the program today that everyone who's working on a PhD in food, in topics related to water and food, this is the best time. Professor Leinhardt, I think you did it years ago. Maybe that was a bit early, but I think your students are really at the right moment in time to do their PhDs. So I hope you will make full use of this moment. I'm not going to repeat a lot of what Chandra had mentioned, especially in the food-water nexus. The fact that that agriculture, food production, is such a big user of water that's out there, and that's a very limited resource that, as we just heard, is a big factor that people are recognizing and are now working around. So that's part of the fear consciousness that is becoming even more. So almost everyone, whether you talk to school kids or sort of people shopping in a grocery store, they are generally now much more aware of this fact than they were before. And in fact, World Bank came out with a report, which I'm sure many of you must have seen very recently. It's called Uncharted Waters, and it sort of lays out very, one of the taglines is that the future is thirsty and uncertain. So it's not only the fact that we have scarcity of water looming at us, but the fact that it's going to be very uncertain. That it's not something that you can predict easily and model and prepare for. And on the other hand, this is again a chart that Chandra also showed. But I think the one thing that I'd like to point out is that areas where there are going to be the most increase in food consumption, India, China, that part of the world, is exactly the area where there's going to be extremely high water stress as well. So in a way, the problem is much bigger than just the overall aggregate number show, because the areas where there is a need for that food to be consumed, there's the need for that nutrition to be made available, are the areas where there's going to be the least amount of water available. And then, but while that's the case, you may say, where, for people here and other parts of the world where there is water, at least for now, there's water abundance, why would people care about that, given the general political environment around, there's a retreat from globalization. But that's not the case, because I think in whichever part of the world you are in, people are experiencing the effects of water stress. We've seen California, we've had a lot, nice couple of years, but every time there's a drought, if you look at it, it's increasing its intensity, and that's experienced by people, that's noticed by people, and that's something that impacts how they think about the problem globally. And I mentioned Brazil. Brazil is probably the biggest exporter of water, and it's likely to be, given the amounts of freshwater resources it has and it will continue to have. But even in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, the drought that we had 2 years ago there, where their reservoir had only 5% of its capacity available, and there were water refugees out of Sao Paulo. Now you cannot, in a country like Brazil, if people have that kind of experience, then you can imagine that they will take that into account as they are looking at whether it's policy formulation, whether it's whether it's thinking about agronomic practices, whether it's thinking about technology to be applied, and so on. So clearly, the fear is not confined to the areas where there's going to be the biggest impact only. It's becoming much more widespread. And then on top of that, we have the realization about in our food system that what we consume, which was never there, in terms of how do we relate that to water use. And there are many, many different ways of communicating that are coming out. I'm glad that you have your keynote speaker tomorrow from the Water Footprint Network. And that's one of the things that I've always wondered. Why don't we have something like the carbon footprint, something that's easily put on a label that can tell consumers as to how much water is going into what they're eating, and kind of thing goes from 13 liters for tomatoes to about 2,400 liters for a hamburger. And then one of the most interesting ones that I saw was that for a bar of chocolate, the amount of water that goes in to produce a bar of chocolate is equivalent to 10 bathtubs of water. So these are the things that people are now becoming much more aware of, and therefore can make decisions. And the people who can make these decisions, one of the other trends that we have an enormous amount of population moving into middle class. They have purchasing decisions to make, and with this information, they are already making the right kind of purchasing decisions. But while the consumers are behaving, in a way to take this information into account, institutions and corporations are also taking this very seriously, and not only because this has social, economic, ecological impacts that Chandra also mentioned, but also it has clear business risks that people were not taking into account before. It has operational risk, reputational risk, and regulatory risk, and we've seen a lot of companies get into trouble, if they ignored aspects of water management, or or how they communicate about water, or their long-term thinking about water as well. And that's now going into corporate planning cycles, and that's having an impact on how these companies think about their stance towards water. And this whole Nexus thinking, which is a field of study itself, is helping in a way that goes beyond just thinking about one of these topics in isolation. It's forcing people to think about the interlinkages and how they can again look at not just in agriculture how do we make it more efficient in terms of water use, but it's about water use, it's about water discharge, it's about water storage, it's about how they source their water, how much energy has gone into producing that, and all of that. And I think that whole comprehensive accounting that this Nexus thinking brings is again, adding to that field of knowledge that allows people to really be concerned about it. And once they're concerned about it, because you can aggregate this and present it in an accounting format, then they are forced to do something about it. Being forced to do, now coming to sloth, being forced to do something about it, the easiest way is to then put the right price on this resource. And that's been very difficult because water is a commons, is a resource that is difficult to isolate or not make available generally to people. And that has been a biggest challenge in terms of putting the right price on water. But we have seen that even in California, where we have, it's nothing like Australia. We don't have very developed water markets, but at the time of droughts, those gray portions that you see on the graph, that's when the water markets increased and improved over time. And so this water markets work. So when there is a problem, people figure out and try to put some value on that resource that is becoming more scarce. And that is continuing to happen. So even without a lot of, so it needs, and maybe this needs a panel on its own, Ivana, what are the technical, institutional, and legal sort of requirements, prerequisites that are, that should go into creating an efficient market, and what are therefore the economic outcomes that we should be looking for. And there's a lot of work that has been done. I know Sloan's done a lot of work in this as well. Chicago's done some work on it. But it's definitely one of those areas where, to what Professor Madramootoo said, not only for smallholder farmers, of course, if we put the right price on a resource like water, it's going to be the smallholder farmers who are going to be affected the most in terms of their ability to pay. But overall, stability and predictability of water water use and availability will be much better. And therefore, it's up to the institutional, legal, and the governmental support to handle some of those other unintended consequences of markets working to put the right value on water, and maybe alleviate some of the impacts that it'll have on smallholder farmers. But definitely going towards a market pricing solution is a big, is going to be a big game changer. And where it's happening, it's resulting in better allocation of resources. It's resulting in better technology application, better water management systems. The data is out there. We've seen from the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia with different parts of the world. It works. And there's no doubt about that. So I think if we can figure out a way to implement, to have markets function, to put a price on water, but then also to have institutional and public support for those who are going to be affected by the most by it, and maybe need some level of support to make sure that those markets continue to get the participation that they need. That's one big area where we need to put together our heads and work on. One country that has done it very well, Israel. You had mentioned that as well. In terms of water recycling, Israel recycles 80% of its water. US does only 5%. And if you look at agriculture, even in Israel, overall, it's the same statistic. Agriculture uses about 70% of the water that is available. But if you look at the amount of fresh water that agriculture in Israel uses, it's much less. It's to the tune of, I think, 30% or so, or even less than that. So that's equivalent of saving 70% of the water that would have otherwise gone in agriculture. That can be used for other purposes. And that's the biggest, I would say, if you look at what they've done in terms of, they realized that cheap water is very costly in the long run. So they started with making sure that they put the right value on water, but then they had the right level of institutional support and technological support and, and ways to make sure that, those kinds of, that pricing is then supported by the technology and institutions that allow people to farm and use that water and not just give up. So that's a good example that I know is getting a lot of visibility out there. In California the governor of California has asked for Israel to support developing markets in California and other even application of technology there. that's something that I will definitely keep an eye out on. Also, in terms of technology, desalination is one of the technologies that Israel kind of committed to very early on, and at high risk. But they have made it work, and I think that has allowed a lot of other people to look at that and work and improve. There are many different flavors of that technology out there now, and the cost of desalination is coming down, and that's one of the things I would love to hear a little bit about over the next 2 days as to how that is progressing and what could be financeable and in what form, and how can we isolate technology risk from operational risk in those kinds of projects. Then the other thing that has happened in terms of making it easy is that public-private partnerships have worked. So South Asia, where it's always very difficult to have farmers adopt new technologies because they just don't have the capacity to put the upfront investment that is needed. This is an example of Jane Irrigation, where IFC and Rabobank came together and helped them develop a package that was allowed that allowed farmers to adopt it in a very very quick manner. It's been a success. Talking about Israel, Netafim is a company from Israel. Again, in this case, the technology is so well proven that we were so comfortable that we did not need any kind of multilateral institution to support this, and we were able to design a program for them that allowed them to offer their technology to farmers in a way that where the farmers are not paying anything for it up front, but it's built into an kind of a farm input financing scheme that they are generally familiar with. But coming back to the last sort of human emotion that is driving the change that I'm so excited about, it's greed, and it's the fact that the consumer people at large, generally, both as consumers and ultimately as investors as well, have realized that they have the information, that they are looking to do good, they're looking to, eat better, they're looking to make sure that they have an impact on the environment that is either less bad or even regenerative in many cases. So that has driven the supply chain down, from the consumer, from the consumer to retail to processing, all the way to the farmer, in a way that hasn't happened before. You have retailers asking for, the kind of information about water use, about carbon footprints, and so on that they were not asking before, and consumers are paying for products where there's a better representation of those practices that they admire. So I think that's been the biggest change, and that is now reflected in, I was just looking at just the last 3 months of the kinds of companies that I've met with and I've heard pitches from, the investors that I've met with and who are looking at different sectors. It's amazing. If you look at just this water-food nexus, whether it's alternative proteins, because proteins, as Chandra also mentioned, is the one area in food where it has the largest consumption of water. And there are lots of alternative protein companies that are looking at doing things in a way that does not have that kind of water footprint. Food waste, again, if you think about, you talked about, markets are not properly organized, but there's a lot of waste. You showed that very nice visual. It's amazing that when you have 70% of your water being used in an activity where the ultimate product, almost 20 to 30, and in the case of US, almost 50% is wasted. It's clear that that's one of the areas where if you want to have efficient water use, you reduce waste. And there's a lot of companies that are working now in that area, getting funding and financing. Increasing farm productivity, that's very clear that we will need to do that, whether it's 1% per annum or more. We definitely need to increase farm productivity to be able to feed the 10 billion that we need, that we expect by 2050. Lots of companies, active in that area, including companies that are looking at how do we make water use more efficient. And one in particular comes to my mind. This was about 2 years ago. I was looking at something where we needed some data on to be able to do our model. We send out our Outlook report several times every year, and usually this is done. We need 3 or 4 months of lead time because we are waiting for data from the USDA to be able to predict the different crop outputs that we use in that Outlook. We have an equilibrium model that sort of takes all of that data into account. But I met this company called Descartes Systems, which was working on remote sensing, but not only remote sensing, the combination of the information that is available through remote sensing, other sensors on the ground as well, with sort of big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and just the way you can have now machines see complex ecosystems. That is, from a human perspective, not possible. And especially water, the use of water in agriculture is a part of a very complex ecosystem. To be able to then work on these, use the technologies that are available at price points that are very, very affordable, whether it's remote sensing, whether it's cloud computing, whether it's machine learning, it's allowing kinds of modeling and prediction to be done including water use. That was just not water use, water stress, predicting yields and so on. That was just not possible even 5 years ago. So that's, I think that's again going to be, it's improving every year at exponential rates, and I think that's going to allow people in this room, researchers, people who are going to work on technologies, to come up with faster cycle times to get to their, to get their ideas to the field. It's going to lead to, much better applications of some of the technologies that were, that didn't come out of the lab for long periods of time, and I'm really excited about that. The next two, adapting to new environments. So there's a lot that is happening in various flavors, like whether it's indoor farming, greenhouses, urban farming. That's because of the urbanization that is happening, and because of, again, the consumer asking for better locally grown food. There's a lot of activity, a lot of investment going in that pillar over there. And then the last one is around genetics, so using bioengineering new food sources, including food sources that are going to use less water or are going to be able to use saline water as well. So that's, to me, it's just the number. This is just a selection of companies, the names and the logos that you see. There are many more out there. So, and this has never happened before. This kind of proliferation of activity where companies are out there, they're getting investments, they're working, with products, getting products out to the market, earning revenues. This has never happened in this sort of with this intensity before. So I definitely urge you to pay attention to this and maybe become a part of this. This movement. I'll just have some statistics. So here, the Impossible Burger uses 95% less water, 95% less land and 74% less water. Using protein from crickets uses, compared to the same amount of protein, cows need 2,000 gallons, crickets need 1 gallon. So all of this is getting, these are very clear metrics that people can see, and it's getting a lot of attention. I won't, stay on. There are a number of, different technologies that are out there, number of different business models out there. Just if you think about indoor farming, aerofarms is one. These are big, very, large-scale indoor farms that have a particular way of producing produce. And then, by the way, they can produce anything. They can produce soy and corn and wheat as well, even though that will require a different, the kind of economics is definitely much better with produce right now. But if you look at just the indoor farming area, aerofarms is large-scale, big. Farms on the outskirts of the cities. There are bright farms and Gotham Greens that are more rooftop within the city greenhouses. And there's freight farms, which is more distributed production of same, produce and greens and so on. So there are so many different business models that are becoming possible. This is not just one. So it's not the case of investors going to, one type of technologies that they feel is going to be successful, and therefore they're putting a lot of money in that and just waiting for which one is going to survive. This is not one technology. These are multiple technologies. These are multiple ways of doing business, multiple ways of earning revenues that are getting tried out there. And this is as I say, the food science is sexy again. These companies are employing so many people from food science, from engineering, from all kinds of different fields. The Aerofarms in particular has a lot of MIT graduates that have joined them. So I truly believe that if you look at this, if you follow the money, there's a lot that is going. If you look at the investments that have been made in ag tech, and if you think about the nexus to water, I would say 80 to 90% have a nexus to water. So if you follow the money, there's a lot of activity out there, and there's a lot, I would say, a need for attention and need for intellect to go into those areas, and I would say also a need for marketing. Yes, there's a lot of awareness that has been created. There's a lot of action that is already happening with people becoming more conscious. But I think we still need, water is still an issue that needs better marketing. So I was giving you the example of Bright Farms, Aerofarms. So when I go to, whether it's Whole Foods or any other grocery store, where I know which ones are grown, which ones are indoor farmed greens, and I buy them. If you look at the label, they will talk about everything. They will talk about the amount of freight. It has not, the fact that they haven't traveled a lot, the long distance from California that your regular produce does. They will talk about even the shelf life, because this is fresh. It's not 7, 8, 10 days old. But they don't talk about the fact that they use 95 to 80% less water. And that's because, again, there's a limited space, and they are trying to put out their marketing messages in the order that resonate with people. And so we need the issues of water to resonate a bit more with people. There's a lot more need for better marketing there, and therefore, again, I'll be curious to hear what the water footprint organization has to say about that. But in the end, I would say, yes, maybe the best time to plant a tree, to dig a well, was 20 years ago, but definitely the second best time is now. And you are all living it, and I'm so grateful and happy that we have a conference like this and people who are focused on this topic. Thank you very much.